In Australia, generally, you will find a range of housing styles and options for rent, including apartments, townhouses, attached row houses, 3 and 4 bedrooms with gardens, which would mean a really small backyard, styles that vary from very historic homes that have been updated to very modern, streamlined apartments. Generally, it should be noted that the standard for homes in Australia is less in size than the US, so we suggest that you carefully consider what you're going to be bringing to Australia and whether or not your furniture will fit. Availability varies greatly by state and city, rural versus city. And in Australia at the moment, with a slight downturn in the economy and the change in the mining sector, there's more availability in Western Australia, Perth, and Queensland, typically Brisbane, which have been affected by the slowing of the mining activity. Conversely, and opposite, the Sydney and Melbourne markets are very busy right now. Market demand is very high and outweighing the supply, placing upward pressure on rental prices. This is particularly so for Sydney properties where interested parties are willing to pay very much higher rents than are advertised to secure their preferred properties. The Australian real estate market in the eastern capital cities has enjoyed many years of strong property growth, and as a result there may be a lack of supply, especially in the 3 to 4 bedroom home area in many of the popular suburbs in particular. As a consequence, real estate agents will not allow private viewings. Sometimes there's an exception for that, for very high prices, but generally it's not possible to see properties under a private viewing. Instead, agents prefer that the property be shown on an open day schedule, where customers can view the property at a time when the property is open for viewing. So you should expect that you might have to work around those kinds of timeframes and availability to view properties. Assignees need to be really decisive and act quickly so that we can secure their preferred property. With so much demand on properties, agents are looking for applications to be seamless, prepared properly, and delivered quickly. And flexibility around accommodating individuals' requests or anything variant to what's on offer is not accepted really by the agents if there's a lot of demand. Pricing for rental homes are listed in weekly amounts, so when you go to look at an online website and you're looking to get an idea of what it would be listed for, please note that the amounts are in weekly amounts, not monthly. Very important, otherwise you can be quite confused. We encourage our assignees to take a look at the websites before they arrive so that they can get an idea of what kind of amenities and pricing is available for properties. But typically don't expect to find that those same properties are available, because turnover, especially in Melbourne and Sydney, is so quick that those properties are typically gone by the time you arrive in country. A couple other things to take a note of in Australia. Company leases, that would be when the company wants to put the name of the company in the lease instead of the individual. Agents and landlords are requesting more information if you have a company lease. Administratively, it's going to be more complex to do a company lease. Because of the supply and demand in Australia, they simply want a straightforward lease, and a company lease puts additional requirements on the agent. So again, really important to understand that if you're going to go for a company lease, you're going to have to prepare a lot of information about the company in the documentations to secure the lease. No different than if you were an individual. Agents also require copies of occupants' documentation, so that would be the employees' IDs, whether it be passports, visas, driver's license, all of that kind of identification must be provided as well. It's also important to note that in residential tenancy agreements that the prescribed tenancy agreement is required to be used. So we cannot put forward a company lease. We have to work within the constructs of the Australian law and practices. Also, a note about diplomatic clauses. It's very common for companies to ask for a diplomatic clause, which would allow the assignee to leave should they need to for business reasons or cut their assignment short. In Australia, these diplomatic clauses are viewed as a gentleman's agreement. These clauses are not included in the tenancy legislation, and many landlords will not include them at all. Also, I want to point out a couple things about security bonds or security deposits, bonds on properties. All bonds in Australia must be held in trust by a government authority. So that's good because it gives you some security around where that money is held. Generally, the amount of bond paid remains the same amount throughout the tenancy, except in Western Australia, where bonds are able to be increased in line with the residential increases throughout the entire tenancy. Holding deposits. Some agents will require holding deposits to hold a property. In New South Wales, which is where Sydney is, a holding deposit will be required to be paid immediately to hold the property. That's because the demand is so high. In Western Australia, the agent will ask for a holding deposit of either $50 or $100 upon the submission of a tenancy application. And in other cities, generally require either the bond or rent to be paid immediately upon the acceptance of the tenancy. So once the lease has been reviewed and everybody's signed it, they'll expect the bond to be paid right away. So it's important to make a note of those things. One of the other changes in the marketplace in Australia is increased privacy legislation around connection and disconnection of utilities. All utility connections and disconnection forms now need to be signed by the utility customer or the employee. In the area of schools, it's important to note that Australia has a robust public schooling system, as well as private and parochial schools in varying amounts based on the metropolitan area that you're looking at living in. It's important to note that if you are considering using the services of an international school, it can be very expensive and would include a number of considerations for you to have some thought about, from the application fees, but tuition can run from $15,000 a year up to and exceeding $27,000 a year for secondary schools. So it is something to consider when looking at public versus private. Due to the high demand for private school placements, availability in private schools may be difficult. Again, really depends on the metropolitan area and the school that you're looking for. Many families may need to join a waiting list. It's worth noting that most schools are very transparent and work on a first-come, first-served basis. So status with a company or being an important executive is not taken into account. It's where are you on the list, the waiting list. It's also important for families to address this issue very early in the relocation, typically prior to selecting housing. Government schools are a good option to consider. Really important to note that in Sydney and Canberra, government schools require holders of temporary visas to pay a temporary visa holder fee, which could range from $3,200 to $9,900. The top 5 tips that I have for relocating to Australia is, number 1, yes indeed, Australia is an English-speaking country, but it is a very different culture. Even though it's familiar culture, and through movies and lots of pop culture you know about Australia, but living in Australia requires adjustment as well, and it's important to be really aware and cognizant of those aspects of Australian culture, that it is a different culture and that you will go through some culture shock as well. Secondly, Australia has an enormously fragile environment and one that the government protects very seriously. So it's important to note that in its customs requirements from the day you enter the airport to your container for your household goods, customs rules and requirements are very important to pay attention to. And in particular, around the import of your pets, it will take a great deal of planning, as every pet will go through quarantine. It is an expensive process, as well as one that takes a bit of time, but it is possible to do. You just simply have to prepare and know what all the regulations are. Number 3, I'd strongly recommend that you open a bank account before you arrive in Australia. It'll really make the process of home finding and school search much quicker. It's recommended that you open a bank account with an Australian bank. There are a number of major Australian banks, including the National Australia Bank, Commonwealth Bank, ANZ Bank, that have something called migrant banking. Very easy to go online, go through the process of setting up a migrant banking account so that when you arrive in Australia, you have access to funds, and those funds can be used for deposits on your housing, school, and utilities. Fourth recommendation is be very aware of the road rules. And Australia has very specific road rules, very specific speeding rules, toll rules, and also as it relates to child restraint requirements. Very important to know what those child restraint requirements are from the moment you land and before you get into the car, that you have the proper child restraint that meets the requirements, the legal requirements. My last tip is enjoy Australia. Enjoy everything that Australia has to offer. It is a truly beautiful, multicultural, and geographically diverse country, one that I really love living in. I recommend that you explore it, get out there and get to know the country. Australia is referred to as the lucky country, and indeed it is.